Hey guys, Pete here. Season 4 of Fargo ended with, well, not necessarily a reveal, but a big confirmation that it told the origin story of one of Season 2's favorite characters. Because it's an anthology series that exists in the world of the 1996 Coen Brothers movie of the same name, Fargo fans are always on the lookout for connections. The crossover of the characters, the different locations, and the general themes of the original movie. Today I thought I'd put together all the connections I've come across from the movie through Season 4. Of course, that will contain some spoilers if you haven't seen all the seasons, so I do have to put that out there, and now let's get into it. I thought the best way to do this would be chronologically, and since Season 4 takes place in 1950 and 1951, we'll get started there. If you include Ethelrita's history report, we actually go back much further in time. It's the story of the criminal underground in Kansas City, and we see how things escalate to a war between different gangs, and at the end of the season, Abel Vellante, with the backing of the New York City crime families, is able to consolidate power and create the Kansas City Mafia. We'll see this connection in the evolution of the organization as they embark on a northern expansion. The fourth season has a Fargo connection, and that comes in the way of Mort Kellerman. Lloyd Cannon did a weapons deal with the Kellermans, and then called in a favor when he needed someone from out of town to hit the Fata family for him. Mort Kellerman and his hitters are directly responsible for the death of the mother of the then boss of the Fata family, Josto. In the Fata family, we were also introduced with Joe Bulow, who came back from New York City with Abel. Bulow played a big role in the Kansas City part of the story in Season 2, which takes place a couple decades later. Another connection between Season 4 and Season 2 comes in the way of this book, The History of True Crime in the Midwest. We first see this book in the opening of Season 2, Episode 9, and hear an excerpt from its chapter on the massacre at Sioux Falls. This is a big event that happens in Season 2 that we were originally introduced to back in Season 1. In Season 4, we see the book in the opening of the 9th episode, where we get a look at a page from it that describes the events of the upcoming episode. And I suppose it's not a direct connection, but I should mention that since most of the series takes place in Minnesota, we do have one character in Season 4 who's from there. Orietta Mayflower, although she's sort of a twist on that Minnesota Nice vibe in that she is a serial killer here. The last major connection from Season 4 to Season 2 is that origin story I mentioned that Satchel Cannon, who was Loy's son, did in fact grow up to be Mike Milligan, who works for the Kansas City Mafia in Season 2. Satchel was part of a tradition where the two rival families exchanged sons to help keep the peace. Rabbi Milligan, who was also traded more than once as a child, takes him under his wing, and they have to flee town when the gang war escalates. Rabbi dies, he's taken away by a tornado. Satchel makes his way back home to his father, and then sees him murdered right in front of him. Since Rabbi's motivation was to give Satchel a choice to help him avoid having to become a child soldier, which is what happened to him and most of the other kids in this situation, the fate that he ends up with in Season 2 is cast in a different light. And so now let's move on and look at the second season. Season 2 was set in Laverne, Minnesota. It's a small town, it's near Sioux Falls, South Dakota, with most of the events taking place in the winter of 1979. It focused on Lou Solverson, who at this point is in his early 30s. He's a cop who we've already met in his retirement in Season 1. In that way, Season 2 is a direct prequel of Season 1. We see his 6-year-old daughter Molly, who's going to grow up to be one of the main characters in Season 1. I mentioned the massacre at Sioux Falls. We see that play out here. And it's something that we hear the older version of Lou refer to. He talks about that in 1979 quite a bit in his later years. I mentioned the Season 4 connections, and we do see a lot of Joe Bulow. He heads up north to negotiate with the Gerhardt family. Mike Milligan has chosen a life of crime. He works for the Kansas City Mafia. He's trying to work his way up. He plays a big role in the conflict with the Gerhardts, thinking that he'll one day be running this area. In the end, it turns out that he's rewarded for his good work with an office job, working closely with the accounting department in this evolution of the organization that Abel Vellante put into motion. We saw one of his guys, Gail Kitchen, of the Kitchen Brothers, in that mid-credit scene that ends the fourth season. We also see how Mort Kellerman's story ends in a flashback back to 1951. In that, we see that he's killed by Otto Gerhardt, the future leader of the Gerhardt family that the Kansas City Mafia is up against in this season. He's taken out not long after what happened in season 4, and the Gerhardts take over. Since it is a prequel, we see a lot of characters from season 1. The time jump is significant enough that they're all played by different actors, so that's kind of fun. As mentioned, we see the younger Lou and Molly Solverson. In a dream that Lou's wife Betsy has about Molly's future, we see Gus and Greta Grimley, who are part of her season 1 story. We see Ben Smith, who played a role in Sioux City and all the other events that happened in season 2. And at the end, we see a fight between some kids. Some younger kids are getting beat up by some older ones. This turns out to be Grady Numbers and Wes Wrench, aka Mr. Numbers and Mr. Wrench. These two will grow up to work for the Fargo crime syndicate in season 1, and with Mr. Wrench showing up here as a child, he becomes the only character to show up in 3 seasons, which we'll get to. The final big connection from this season is Hanzee Dent. Hanzee worked for the Gerhardts, he was taken in by them as a child, he grew up to be an absolutely effective soldier, only to eventually betray them and go on to start his own Fargo Mob. At the end of season 2, we saw Hanzee getting a new identity and talking about getting plastic surgery. And we'll see how all that played out when we get to season 1. Chronologically, the next thing that happens in this universe is the original film. That took place in 1987. It follows a chief of police named Marge Gunderson, who's investigating a series of murders near Brainerd, Minnesota. We also meet Jerry Lundegaard. He's a car salesman that has money problems. He hatches a plan to have his wife kidnapped, so he hires these 2 out-of-town criminals, and things don't go as planned. As far as the TV show, there's 2 connections. The first would be Stan Grossman. He was a businessman that was a partner of the father of the kidnap victim. He becomes successful, and then in the 3rd season, we hear him mentioned as an acquaintance of Emmett Stussy, the parking lot king of Minnesota. The second connection is more direct, and it concerns a briefcase full of money. One of the hired criminals in the kidnapping plot, Carl Showalter, was collecting a ransom which turned out to be a lot more money than he was expecting. And that's all pretty complicated. But when he finds out how much more money is there, he buries $920,000 in a suitcase in the snow. He marks that with the red ice scraper. He basically hid it so he could cut his partner out, but then when he goes back to their hideout, they get into an argument that ends him up in a wood chipper. And so the knowledge of the money and where it was dies with him. In season 1, we have a flashback to 1987, where the supermarket king of Minnesota, Stavros Milos, finds the money after he runs out of gas and is stranded on the side of the road. Flash forward to the present day in season 1, it takes place in 2006 and 2007 in Bemidji, Minnesota. As mentioned, it centers around the Solverson family, with Molly now being the same age as her father was in season 2. We see all the older versions of the characters I mentioned in the previous section. We see that Mr. Numbers and Mr. Wrench are now full grown. Numbers will eventually be killed by Lauren Malvo, but Mr. Wrench makes it out of season 1 alive. We see the results of Hanzee's identity change. He is now running Fargo under the name Moses Tripoli, but he also ultimately meets his end at the hands of Lauren Malvo. So the final season, season 3, has the shortest time skip. It takes place primarily in 2010. It features 3 Minnesota towns, St. Cloud, Eden Valley, and Eden Prairie, and it's the only season that doesn't have a direct connection to Fargo, North Dakota. It follows the lives of the Stussy brothers, Ray and Emmett, Ray's parolee girlfriend, Nikki Swango. For the moral center, we have Gloria Burgle, who's a policewoman. And the big villain in this installment is VM Varga. To date, none of those characters have any connections to the other seasons. The only connection beyond that brief mention of Stan Grossman from the movie is our 3-season character, Mr. Wrench. I won't retell the whole story of season 3, but Nikki Swango, who I mentioned, finds herself on a prisoner transport bus where she's targeted to be taken out. In one of the best connection reveals, we see that the person that she's sitting next to, that she's handcuffed to, is Mr. Wrench. They're able to escape. They work together as allies in what's arguably the best part of that season, the ending of season 3. And for as far as what we know now, that ends the connections. I'm sure I missed some. There's a lot of small things like bits of dialogue that are repeated across the seasons. But beyond that, there's just so many, I'm sure I missed some. So make sure you tell me in the comments what were your favorite connections and which ones did you catch that I might have missed? With that, I'm going to bring this video to a close. I'm looking forward to the future seasons. While season 3 isn't everyone's favorites, I would like to see some future connections that tie that into the bigger story. There's certainly possibilities in how you see that might play out. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.